What happened to me 3 years ago is hard for me to tell you and talk about. It has traumatized me and has left me a different person. So I will try my best to calmly and carefully explain my situation. So here I go. 3 years ago, I was asked if I can come and stay at my friend's house for a couple of weeks, just to watch their animals for them while they left. This family was a family that I was very close with and had grown up with for a very long time. They lived on the outskirts of a smaller town out in Arizona and had some goats and some dogs and some other miscellaneous livestock, like chickens. They were going on a 2-week stint across the US somewhere, but I couldn't really bother to remember. It's kind of irrelevant. I was in between jobs at this time, pretty rinky-dink ones, and they were going to pay me a pretty penny for the 2 weeks that I was planning to stay out at their house. So, of course I accepted the offer. They live about an hour outside of a small town in Arizona that I can't remember the name of. I just know it's a couple of hours outside of Tucson, but they have their own piece of property with a small stable-like structure that they have built, and they house other livestock in. Goats primarily. Dogs and such, but they don't have any horses or cattle, which I guess is uncommon. To keep their names covered, I'll refer to them as Jack and Danielle. They were both in their later 30s. My family had grown up close with them for quite some time, until they moved outside of Tucson, to where I can only imagine that they still are today, if that is where they are. I'll explain that in a minute. They knew I was out of work and looking for a decent paycheck, so they offered me a 2-week job of looking after their house and their pets for a 2-week stay at their home. But my parents and I had to get me out there, so they bought me a Greyhound ticket. I was only 18 at the time. To my knowledge, Danielle could not conceive, so the only real children they had were their dogs and goats, which was fine by me. It meant less I had to babysit on top of what I was doing, and I figured I could use the time at their place to kind of just chill out and enjoy the hot weather and de-stem from my life here. Little did I know it was going to turn into what it did. So, I got a ticket out there, and I met Jack in Tucson, where he picked me up from the bus stop. I grew up in Southern Cali, along with Jack and Danielle for most of my life, so I was already accustomed to the stifling heat. But I feel like Arizona brought a whole new level. On the car ride out there, he's explaining to me how beautiful it is and how I'm gonna have a great time for these next 2 weeks, and hopefully, I won't be too bored. Arriving on the property was the first real time I even got to see their house. It was much larger than I imagined it. Jack worked a very high-paying job, and Danielle operated a very successful at-home business making clothing, so they were not short for good money. They both took me on a mini tour of the property, where I was able to see their outside shed they built, and see a beautiful handcrafted stable that they made for their goats and dogs. Even though the dogs were so attached to Danielle and Jack, they never slept in it. They primarily slept inside. Hey, whatever, right? It was their fur babies after all. They had a total of 6 goats and 4 dogs and about a dozen chickens. They had a Labrador retriever named Missy. They had a black lab named Buddy. And then 2 blue heelers that were rescued were also sisters that came from the same puppy litter. Their names were Misha and Mega. The goats all had very similar names, kind of reminding me of the dwarfs in the Lord of the Rings book. They briefly explained to me how to take care of them, when to feed them, etc. It wasn't really hard to do. If anybody ever owns livestock, then they would probably know what I'm talking about. I asked them if there was any problems that ever arose. Predators, an animal going into labor that I wouldn't know what to do. They laughed and eased my thoughts, and told me I was overthinking it, that they hadn't had any problems like that, and I should be fine. I was probably just nervous. Little did I know that my life during the stay would change forever, and would of course involve sectors of the government I couldn't dare dream of. But again, I'll get on to that. Thankfully, the upkeep was very minimal, and after that, we went inside and hung out till the evening time, when it was time for them to go and head to the airport to catch their flight. We had a good homemade dinner, and a good talk, and they said their goodbyes. The 4 dogs were pretty in and out of the house. I knew they would keep me good company. I had Jack and Danielle's number, so if I needed anything, I would just be able to reach out to them first. We finally said our goodbyes, and then that was it. They headed off, and I would not see them again till the following Saturday after the next. It was Friday, and they were set to arrive back the Saturday morning after the next. 2 weeks exactly from the following morning. So more like 2 weeks and a half a day. Surprisingly, Jack and Danielle had pretty good internet out where they were, considering it was kind of just the middle of nowhere. There wasn't much around. Oh, and if you consider the desert beautiful, then you would be in heaven here. The next few days would prove fairly uneventful, and nothing really happened. I would go outside periodically and spend some time with the goats and play with the dogs. Other times I would watch TV, or play on my phone or what have you, even dinking around on YouTube. They had a really nice guest room with a very expensive mattress, so to say I slept like a baby is a complete understatement. It was either on the third or fourth day, I can't remember. I woke up in the middle of the night to some loud banging and noise outside of the stable, and the goats screaming. I figured one of the dogs slipped out and was causing a ruckus, so I was already starting to get irritated because I was awakened from my perfect slumber. Groggy and angry, and getting up out of bed, I was getting ready to get out there and yell at the dogs for getting out of the stable, and I made it to the back door and opened it. Stepping out and walking to the stable, I continued to hear a bunch of commotion. I had a flashlight with me, so I'm shining it, and I get to the small stable door, and before I can open it, I hear something big trail off in the night behind the stables. I open the door, revealing all goats that were visibly fine, but they seemed incredibly shaken. I remember thinking, what was that? What on earth is going on? I was spooked, but my mind made excuses like it was probably a big coyote or something. The whole thing just gave me the heebie-jeebies. It felt wrong. After a few minutes of trying to calm them down, and myself, I decided it was time to go back to bed. Upon stepping back in the house, I see the 4 dogs passed out on the floor by the kitchen snoring. Yikes. I don't know how I missed that. I'm not really sure what happened there. Hopefully I don't have to deal with setting up traps to catch a coyote or something. And besides, I could have sworn I set the dogs in the stable. Maybe it will resolve itself, I thought. I went and laid back down, taking me probably an hour or 2 to finally fall back asleep. I was awakened by Missy slobbering all over my face that morning. The same next day, I went out to go check on the goats, which they seemed to be fine now, after their little strange extravaganza from last night. Now that it wasn't pitch black, I decided to walk on the back side of the stable, where I'd heard whatever it was jumped out and take off into the desert night. I could see that a piece of the stable had a broken opening. This left about a 3-foot hole in the bottom, and that a small animal could easily fit in. I couldn't tell if it had been like that way for a while, or something from the outside had broken in. My first instinct was to let Jack and Danielle know that we might have a coyote problem. I tried calling both their phones, but they were either off or no service. I got a call back from them later in the day, asking if everything was okay, and I briefly told them about what had happened and my findings. Jack instructed me to not hesitate to pull out his rifle that he had stored away, if I needed to, and they had issues with coyotes in the last few years, but not any time recent. I kinda just said okay, sounds good. But once I got off the phone, I was freaking out. I'm just a kid from South California. I never even held a gun before, let alone shoot one off. I didn't even know how to load it. I can only hope that more problems didn't arise. A couple more nights came and went, and things seemed calm again. On one of the following nights, I was jolted awake by a slamming on the window, and when I turned, I nearly fell out of the bed. Glaring at me from the window was this hideous face you'd see out of a video game. If I were to give you a description, it looked just like the Faulkner from Skyrim, except it had large black eyes and long jagged teeth. I started screaming and ran out of the room. I don't know why it was slamming on the window. I guess it was trying to get in. My running into the living room freaked out the dogs and woke them up, and they started barking and going into a frenzy. I quickly grabbed a long knife from the kitchen and crouched down behind the counters and waited for the thing to get into the house. All the while, The dogs were going crazy. After sitting there for a couple of moments, I realized I had the advantage because I had 4 hungry dogs with me, or so I thought. I must have forgot to feed them dinner. I figured they would take quick work of whatever this was, so I quickly ran over to the sliding door, opened it, and let all 4 dogs out while they went haywire. I waited there by the sliding door for a few moments until they came back, but they didn't seem bothered anymore. I mean, really bothered at all. If anything, I think a few of them had used that opportunity to use the bathroom, but they didn't act like anything had been out of place. I was still freaked the hell out, so I locked up everything and went to lay down on the kitchen floor beside the cabinets with a knife in hand. I don't know what time I fell asleep. At this point, sleeping in the guest bedroom was now completely out of the question. The next morning, I had a terrible feeling in my gut. How on earth am I going to call Jack and tell him what happened? He's not going to believe me. Believe that some psycho in some Halloween mask tried to break into the house, if that is what even happened. Maybe I dreamt it. I don't know. Maybe I was going crazy. I decided that I was probably going stir crazy and was mentally losing it, so I decided to spend most of the day outside in hopes that the sun would help alleviate that. I spent some time looking around but didn't see anything that looked out of place. I honestly believed I was beginning to lose it. That night, I decided that it would be safe if I slept in the living room with the dogs around me and a knife on the table next to me, just in case anything happened. Like clockwork, I woke up again to the sound of goats going crazy in the stable, and like a soldier being woken up by combat, without thinking, I sat up to grab my knife and ran towards the sliding glass door with my flashlight. The dogs that too were awakened were going crazy, so I figured if we're all going out there, we'd be able to put a stop to whatever was causing havoc in the stable. This is where things turn from normal to absolute insanity, and I have to remind myself that yes, I was in reality when this happened. Me and the dogs run to the stable door, and there is so much noise going on. Before I go on to where I open the door, I could hear the goats screaming and going crazy, more intensely than they were before, of the previous night. The dogs around me are barking and going nuts, but I also heard some unknown noises along with all the other noise, hissing, and some sort of unknown animal screeching noise. I fling open the small stable door and shine my flashlight, and this is where my reality turned into that of a Hollywood horror movie. 5 goats remained in the spots they've always been, freaked out, and one of them was on the ground, dead. Its throat had been torn out and was being eaten on. However, it wasn't as simple as that, as much as I would like it to. When I shined my light, 2 unknown creatures looked to be in a brawl. One creature I saw had blood all over its face, and I immediately recognized it to be the same creature that had slammed on the guest bedroom window the other night. It was shorter than I expected, and kind of weird looking, almost alien-like, but terrifyingly humanoid, with a large head and long spindly claws and fingers. What terrified me even more was the other creature that it was fighting against. It looked like a human, and a dinosaur had a baby. It was very reptile-like, almost kind of like a dinosaur, I guess I would say. It had long black claws and jagged-like reptile teeth, and it was fighting the other animal. It also had piercing yellow eyes that seemed to glow. Both of these creatures dwarfed the goats around them, and the dogs that surrounded me straight up abandoned me and fled whining back to the house, just at the sight alone. I honestly feel like in that moment, I went into total shock and stood there paralyzed. This reptile creature pinned down the other creature, whatever it was, and tore a large piece of meat off of its side, where that creature screamed the most inhuman scream I've ever heard. They somehow didn't even notice me, or seem to care I was shining the light right on them, if this was going on. As it tore the chunk of meat off, blood splattered, and it pushed itself up and tore through the back of the stable, breaking much more of the wood off and ripping open the board, while this reptilian creature chased after it. Both creatures running on all fours with blood everywhere. Not only was the goat in front of me dead, with its throat torn out, but I also noticed that there was this weird slimy substance all over the inside of the stable. It's kinda like saliva-y, but it was different. It had a dark color to it and was very thick, kinda like a goop. Then there was the blood from whatever these two creatures were fighting against. I don't think I really had time to process what reality was, honestly. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and all I could do was phone the police, and told them creatures were trying to break in and kill my goats. Even the operator was acting kind of strange about what I'd like to do. She kept saying, "What do you mean creatures?" I just kept saying, "I need an officer here now. I need an officer here now." About 12 minutes later, as I'm pacing around the front, trying to process whatever my reality now was, as an officer shows up outside the house. He was a very nice older gentleman who had heard what I had to say and then went back there to go check it out for himself. He comes back a few minutes later, and he asked that I call the owners, Jack and Danielle, and let them know that they were needed back here as soon as they could. The officer seriously explained to me, after observing everything that happened, that this was far more serious than he initially thought. Whatever that means. He left and kept things very vague. He really didn't give me any information. I immediately called Jack and Danielle, waking them up in the middle of the night, freaking out, telling them exactly what I saw that happened. They both went quiet. I was on speakerphone, so I heard both their reactions. They didn't say much, which kind of freaked me out even more. Jack just said he'll be there first thing in the morning, and he'll get a flight as soon as he could. I head inside the rest of the night with a knife in my hand, and the dogs, and not knowing what the hell I just saw, or if I was in some joke or prank show, or possibly a horror movie. Maybe somewhere along the way, somebody slipped me some LSD, and this was all just a bad trip. I honestly believe I was just in total shock, and that I couldn't fully process what was going on. For the next period of time, I want to say an hour, I sat there on the kitchen floor with 2 knives in my hand, waiting, rocking back and forth. I don't think I fell asleep, but felt extremely detached from reality. I heard a knock at the door. At this point, it's early on in the morning, still dark out. I put the knives down and answered it. It was several investigators who were asking me a bazillion questions. Their entire demeanor was hostile. They even looked funny. They reminded me of Secret Service agents. There was probably about 12 of them with large black SUVs, and they were all standing out in front, with several of them with strange equipment I have never seen before, heading towards where the stable had been, or where the stable was. They told me to step out of the house, and they detained me immediately and put me inside their SUV for the time being. I don't know how long I spent in the back of an SUV, but after some time, 4 of them climbed in the back and then blindfolded me. We drove for what felt like hours and hours until we came to a stop. I was led by force out of the vehicle into this strange building, down several flights of stairs, until they sat me down into this large room. They took my blindfold off and my cuffs. I looked like I was in what appeared to be a large room that you would see in police stations used for questioning, except this was double the size and a little bit more dangerous looking. There were 2 of the same agents standing there at the door, guarding, when another agent came through. At this point, I was bawling, terrified, sleep deprived. I had no idea what was going on. Nobody was telling me anything. I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know if I was safe or who these people were. The man who sat directly at the table across from me appeared to be what I would call very polished. He looked artificial, if that makes sense. Like his skin didn't look right. I don't know if that means anything. He remained very mono-expressive and monotone. He showed zero emotion in his face or voice. He began by asking me some bizarre questions. Some I can't fully remember, but others I do remember. Like, what did you do when you saw the unknown animal observing you through the window a few nights ago? Things like that. I would freak and ask them how they knew these things, but he remained stern and didn't answer any of my questions. He only repeated his questions until I gave him an answer. After some back and forth, he got up quietly without saying a word and left the room. I sat there for probably God knows how long, and then he came back in the room again and sat down. He briefly told me that I'm never allowed to talk to anybody about my time at that location. what I saw or did, and I am never to speak to Jack and Danielle again. He reiterated that there would be serious repercussions if I denied those commands. I told him where to go and how to get there, and for the first time in our conversation, he gave a brief smirk and calmly said, "So be it," and got up and left. 2 men entered the room, looking like every other strange service agent person, and held me down and injected some strange fluid into my neck. No matter how hard I fought, they seemed to have an iron grip over me, like it was unnatural. I couldn't fight back. I lost consciousness quickly. The next thing I know, I wake up in a hospital bed, 4 days later in Southern California, only miles out from where I live with my parents at my bedside. I began screaming, crying, freaking out, screaming so loud that the doctors and nurses come rushing in to find out what's wrong. I began screaming that I needed to talk to Jack and Danielle. My parents just gave me the grimmest look, while the doctors and nurses were trying to calm me down. My dad sat down on the bed, looked off into space, and sighed. He said, "Son, nobody has been able to get a hold of either of them. It's been 4 days now. Nobody knows what happened. They've been reported missing, and there's already a missing persons report for each." I screamed more and more and questioned how I got here. What happened? I was told that I was found lying on the side of a highway nearly 12 miles from this hospital and was taken here when someone found me. I couldn't stop crying. I was literally going insane. I remembered everything. As soon as things became calmer, the doctors and nurses left the room and gave my parents and I our privacy. I told them everything that had happened while I was there, and that I was taken by these strange men. They just looked at me and told me they're going to let me rest. I don't think they believed me. Surprisingly, they didn't even ask how I ended up 12 miles out on the middle of a highway being picked up by somebody. I don't know why or how. Fast forward in time until right now, where I moved out shortly after coming home from the hospital. I moved out with some friends and moved states away where I could work a small job. I haven't been mentally right since this traumatic event occurred. It's really screwed me up emotionally. I still have never talked to Jack or Danielle since this occurred, and don't know what became of them. I tried sending them handwritten letters to their address, only to get my mail sent back to me, saying that address doesn't exist. I've tried calling them, but the numbers just nothing exist. I've had an increasingly difficult time with life as of late, and have even contemplated suicide. Something happened that I wasn't supposed to see or be a part of. Something that involved the government. I feel like I'm in some weird episode of X-Files or something. More importantly, I want to know what happened to Jack and Danielle. The last time I spoke to them was over the phone that night, and that was it. I wonder what happened to them, if they ever made it back. I'm sorry this is so long, but I'm so desperate to reach out for help. I've already reached out to multiple people, groups, individuals, all telling my story, and nobody is taking me seriously, even as big as a risk as I am taking. I don't know what else much to do. I want to know what happened, what I saw, and what that had to do with me being detained and questioned. Who are the people that detained me? Why was I being questioned? Where is Jack and Danielle? I need some answers. For now, I'm going to try and remain sane, even in this quarantine where life is even more uncertain. I believe I have a strange incident worth mentioning that involves the Mothman, but I'm not entirely sure. I'll leave it up to you to put those pieces together. See, my knowledge of the Mothman is very minimal, but I do know that there was something involving a town called Point Pleasant, in which the Mothman appeared on a bridge, and then after, it was cited that the bridge collapsed, or something along those lines. Listen, I've barely done much research, but enough to know that what is basically described is the gist of what happened. The way I would describe it is this being is called to be a bad omen. That relates to the incident that I'm about to tell you about, because it's the only thing that leads me back to believing that this is the same being that I saw. A couple of years back in the wintertime, I was visiting my brother, who didn't live far away from me, and he had become very ill. The doctors were not able to figure out what exactly was wrong with him, and his illness had taken him to such a depth that I had to start taking time off work to seriously help him out. He wasn't married and didn't have any kids, so him and I were really all each other had. Mom and Dad had passed away long ago, and we were still very close. His illness continued to get worse and worse, and he would have random bouts of night terrors, extreme vomiting, deliria, sometimes totally forgetting who he was and where he was at. He would fall unconscious at random times, appearing to have seizures. Blood tests, CT scans, you name it. Every test under the sun doctors ran on him, but nothing would come back conclusive. It was truly baffling. Doctors and nurses could not find anything wrong with him. He even tested for cancer, but came back negative on multiple occasions. Then, he went through a period where he seemed to be surprisingly getting much better, much faster than he was deteriorating. He was regaining his energy and strength like never before, and for the first time in a long while, I was able to be independent. I had visited him a couple times during this, and while he was regaining his strength back, it was at this point as I was leaving the house one evening that I saw what looked to be a tall black bat-like figure perched up on top of his chimney, staring down at me with bright red eyes. I don't know what I was looking at, or if I was having an hallucination or what, but I got out of my truck and I shook my fist at it and told it to get away from my brother. I thought it was a demon, but little would I know that it was truly coming for his life. I screamed at it, I cussed at it, I called it everything under the sun, and it just sat there, looking at me, and then in a flash of light, flew off. I've never felt so angry before. I understand you might consider my reaction crazy, because most people would not have reacted that way. Most people would have been terrified to see what I did. But the overwhelming feeling of this thing coming to prey on my weakest, sickly brother made me sick, even if his condition was drastically improving at the moment. Let me explain. I'm very overprotective over my brother, and always have been. I would find myself in bouts of bravery, even at times where normal people should have been terrified over the course of growing up. That involves high school bullies and other abusive situations between my father, him, and I. He's my flesh and blood, and I'll always love him, even if he is gone and in a better place. I would later on research and find out what it was that was on his chimney, and everything seemed to point to the whole Mothman phenomenon, which I had nothing on or any knowledge about. I do remember reading something about the whole Point Pleasant Bridge and it crashing, and just a bunch of other sightings of people have had in the time being. I think I've mainly brushed it off the time and tried not to think too much about it. I didn't care if I saw a supernatural being or not. I wasn't going to let it do anything to my brother, because honestly, that's the feeling I got from it. As soon as I looked into its eyes, into infinity, I couldn't shake the feeling, like it was the Grim Reaper coming for my brother's soul. A few days go by, and I get a call from one of his close friends who's at his house, telling me that his condition has suddenly decreased, and he needed to be transported to the hospital ASAP. Of course, I raced over there, doing all I could to take care of my brother, and we called an ambulance. He was taken to the hospital, where he had received great care, but his conditioning kept worsening. About 2 days later, he passed away in the hospital. Even his cause of death was unknown, and the doctors marked it as a natural cause. They conducted an autopsy, but reported nothing abnormal. His death was the hardest thing to ever have happened to me in my life, and I'm still not fully recovered from it. I don't think I ever will. You just don't recover from something like that. The meaning behind me telling you this isn't about the fact that I lost my brother. It's the fact that I want to know what I saw, and if it had anything to do with his sudden passing. You look at the Point Pleasant situation, and it appearing there was like an omen. Is this one of those superstitious situations where if you see the Mothman, something bad is going to happen? That's what I began to question, and my sanity has soon slipped away. I'm not sure about anything anymore. and no research I can find is truly concrete. I'm just asking you for answers, since you seem to know a lot about this kind of stuff and the paranormal. The only thoughts I can honestly confide in is that my brother is now in a more peaceful state. I don't know what mystery illness he had, or why he died when he did, even though he seemed to be getting better. But he's gone now, and I'm still fighting day after day to accept it. The best thing I could do at this point is to get answers as to what and why. Believe me, I know if I see the Mothman again, he's probably going to be coming back for me, and he ain't going to win so easily. I won't let him. You might think I'm crazy, but I swear on what I say is truth. I do believe that I've been seeing this creature, what many call the Mothman, flying around at night around where I live. To make matters worse, many of my family has seen it too, and they all have their own stories. Of course, everybody's story and situation is different, but mine feels a little more terrifying. I've only ever seen it at night, and it only ever reveals itself by sitting on top of a tree or somewhere on top of my house, waiting for me to exit so it can terrify me. I've shot at it multiple times, but to no avail. Bullets don't even seem to bother this thing, and it never makes a sound. Even as it flies through the air or flaps its wings, nothing. Not even the air around it moving. It resembles that of a human with large wings, kind of like a bat. I've seen its face, and it looks more evil than some of the movies that I've seen on TV. I know deep down in my heart that this thing comes from the pits of hell, and I've done every ritual, every ward, every prayer to try and get rid of it, and nothing works. I don't know why it's stalking me and my family, but it seems intent on getting something that it wants. I just don't know what that is yet. It doesn't appear every night, but it shows itself often just to let me know that it's there. At night sometimes, I'll hear it walking around on my roof, and then it suddenly disappears, just as soon as it appeared. I can't even step outside at night for a cigarette without feeling this stifling thick feeling of something wrong. It's so thick in the air, you can cut it with a knife. I'll always know he's around because of the bitter feeling in my stomach, the uneasiness he gives off. It makes your hair stand up. Nothing can compare to the fear this thing emits. It doesn't attack though, nor has it ever tried to. That's the scariest part. It just waits and watches, as if it's waiting for something. Waiting for the right time to strike, or the right moment to act. It's calculating, its movements, it's strategizing. The way it watches me, watches my family. It's unnerving, and I know it's planning and plotting something. I've gone to pastors, I've gone to healers, I've gone to psychics. Nobody has a concrete answer as to what I'm dealing with. I burn sage and I place wards around my house, but it's like this being doesn't even seem to notice nor care. I fear I will never get rid of it till it finally gets what it wants. I live in the greater Chicago area, all the way out by myself. I'm far enough away from any neighbors that I'm more secluded, and I've even opened up the lines of dialogue between me and my neighbors and have asked them, regardless of them thinking I'm crazy, if they have had any similar experiences. Of course, none of them do, and don't know what I'm talking about. It either makes them a liar, or they are in denial. It makes me feel even worse, because I know whatever this is solely targeting me and my family. Listen, I don't know if you know anything about what I'm going through, but I'm desperate. Maybe it wants my soul. Maybe it wants me dead. I don't know. All I know is that this thing is on a mission, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. I just hope that what it wants isn't me, or any one of my family members. I was 17 when I had my first encounter with something strange. I was hiking through some tall brush near my mother's house, about an hour south of Los Angeles, when I saw something weird moving up a hill. I saw an animal, as I later discovered, or maybe not an animal. It was walking on two legs, but looked like a cricket-looking thing. I kid you not. At first, I thought it was a man in an insect costume or something. It was so strange. It had the tiniest little appendages coming out of its back that were about a foot long each. This creature also appeared to have antennae. It was also slowly moving up this large hill, but moving very strangely. It scared me, so I ran back to my house and didn't say anything to my mother. She wouldn't believe me anyway. I was smoking a lot of weed throughout my time at my mom's at that time, so she probably would have attributed it to that. But I tell you what, no amount of weed is going to make you see what I did. As the day wore on, I received a very strange call from a friend. He called my house later on in the afternoon, saying he was out on a trail in San Fernando Valley and that I would never believe what he had seen. My friends all grew up in West Hollywood, so I know they've seen some things, but this was something much different. To my horror, he told me over the phone that he saw this insectoid-like creature, describing it to the T what I just saw hours prior to that happening. I started panicking over the phone and told him what I had seen earlier in that day and that it was the same thing he saw. He got quiet. The silence was broken with him saying that at least he knows that we're both not crazy. Not much was said after that. He always confided in me to tell me very personal things, so I had no doubts he was telling the honest truth. It disturbed me, is what it did, considering I just seen the same creature he had only hours before. The burning question remains, what are these creatures? I saw an insect mantis type of creature. It was in the remote wilderness of Illinois, a place I know very little about. I was trying to do some hiking on foot. I pulled into a campsite that had been long abandoned. No people, nothing. Just the old remains of a bonfire and the occasional crow or raven around. One of these creatures stepped out of the woods and looked around. It was huge. It was quite tall, with what appeared to be a kind of crest on the top of its head. It also had a long, black, rubbery-like tail that reached out about 3 feet from behind the creature. I was terrified, but it didn't appear to notice me. It's like it came out of the woodline and not knew that I was there. This was basically a man-sized mantis-like creature. I was not a trained outdoor expert or anything, and in my naivety, I had probably just walked in on this thing's territory. It was a bit too much to handle. I hid behind a spot in the trees and waited for it to enter a new area of woods before I running back to my car and vomiting. The sight of this thing just made me sick. It felt wrong, everything. Even from the moment I pulled up to this camp spot, something felt off, and I knew it. Every year, my family has this huge throwdown barbecue just outside of Houston, Texas, where they live, where all of the family flies down for the weekend and parties. By party, I mean eat lots of smoked barbecued meat, drink beer, and spend time catching up with one another, with copious amounts of wine and other good food. This occurs in the month of July, but this year, because of COVID, our annual event has been canceled. Sigh. So, I'm going to use this opportunity to tell you about something very strange that really weirded me out last year that this happened. So, 2019, we all fly down there. We meet up with everybody. My family's house, well, it's more like an estate because it's a mansion. It's seriously massive. They run a very successful auto business, so they have buku bucks. So there's room for about every one of us to sleep in our own guest bedroom very comfortably. We have a humongous barbecue pit with lots of drinks, wine, beer, alcohol, anything, and plenty of good times. They have tons of acreage and own probably about 50 plus, with just thick forests, lagoons, creeks and rivers, and what have you. When you get there, you almost just want to go on an adventure. They actually have a few golf carts just sitting around for you to get in and drive around the property, due to its sheer size. Look, I love drinking beer and I love eating food as much as anybody, but I really love fishing. The lagoon they have on the back side of their property is one of the coolest spots. It's actually privatized, so they do all their own fishing there. I've been going to it for years every summer when I'm there for the weekend to check it out, and I always try and squeeze in some fishing if I can, even if it's just a session or two. Sometimes it's harder than others, but this time I was determined. Like I said, you had to take a golf cart to even get back to the little pathway that leads out to the lagoon. Then, you take a small trail that's probably only a few hundred yards to a decent-sized lagoon tucked away in the forest. Like I said, it's all private, so we don't have to worry about any other people coming there or competing with anybody. I think there's mainly just small bass and trout, and maybe a few other types of smaller fish. Nothing magnificent or worth bragging about, but it sure is peaceful. I'm gonna be honest with you too. Sometimes I don't want to be hanging around noisy drunk family all the time for the whole weekend. I'm a huge fan of solace and quiet, and there ain't nothing more peaceful than sitting by yourself for hours with your line casted into the water. Thankfully, because of how rich my family is, I didn't have to worry about bringing any of my own fishing equipment. They had a shed nearby dedicated to just housing rods, lines, and lures that I was able to borrow and use anytime I pleased. My family uses this lagoon often for their own private fishing, and it actually feeds into a couple other smaller rivers around the area. I think much of the acreage here that goes on is just undeveloped forest and part of the lagoon. It's not a giant lagoon by any means, but it's relatively good size, and good sized enough that I can't see the end of it, just because it trails off behind the woods and the trees. So I'm sitting there on this little bridge with my line in the water, just enjoying the peace and calm and quiet. I'm close enough to my family and to where I can hear them gut laughing, and I knew in that instant they were already intoxicated. They usually don't get that loud and boisterous until they've had some alcohol in their system. Inebriation is a funny thing. As much as I like to be included in their shindig, I do like solitude, so I was very much enjoying this introverted me time. I wasn't getting a bite like I usual, which is not normal. I've had times of fishing where I wouldn't get a bite for hours, but the past few times I've fished at this lagoon, it's usually stocked full of fish, and wouldn't have to wait too long before I got a nibble. That's when I began to feel that I was being watched, and started feeling really uncomfortable. I ignored it at first, and just kept my focus on the line in the water, but the feeling began to grow stronger, to the point to where I could no longer ignore it. I started looking around, seeing if maybe any family had crept up on me and was trying to play games. Nobody had come around, and that's when I noticed the forest around the lagoon had grown deathly silent. See, that's generally not a good sign, and everything in my insides was telling me I should probably leave. My reasoning and logical brain kept trying to tell me that this is nonsense, and there's nothing wrong. Even though my skin was virtually crawling, I couldn't help but shake the feeling. That's when I saw it for the first time. A little ways off the bridge, to the right, and poking itself out halfway the forest, was what I can only describe to you as an insect-like creature. I know that probably doesn't make any sense to you, but this thing was probably about 8 to 9 feet tall, huge, hulking, and resembled that of a praying mantis in a way. It was much uglier though. It reminded me if you crossed a xenomorph from the Alien movies and a praying mantis. It didn't have that xenomorph alien-like head though that you would see in the movies, but instead just a hideous insectoid-looking head. It even had the praying mantis-like claws where they fold in, and it was standing there on 2 legs. It had these bright yellow eyes, but it was staring at me, and it looked very insect-like. As soon as I made eye contact with it, I knew that it knew that I saw it, and I could feel the evil and hatred emanating from this thing. You know how when you make eye contact with somebody, and you could almost feel into their soul? Well, that's what I felt in that moment. It's like it was communicating to me that it was going to hurt me and kill me. And that moment, I threw down my rod and I ran. Got the golf cart and drove up to the house and stayed there. I was freaked out. I didn't know what to do or who to talk to. Parts of my family thought I was acting strange and wondering why I was not joining in the rest of the family during the times of eating and drinking, but I just used the good old excuse that I wasn't feeling well and I was sick. I never told any of my family what really happened or what I saw, just because they probably wouldn't believe me anyway. I'm no stranger to people talking about seeing weird stuff out in the woods, like Bigfoot, or even the occasional staircase in the middle of nowhere. But I sure as hell ain't heard nobody ever talk about insect creatures taller than me with bright glowing yellow eyes. Certainly, that was a new one. Maybe that has to do with the lagoon and why it felt different that day. There's also more fog than usual, and things in general just felt off. Maybe that's the reason why the fish weren't really biting.